As we are discussing exceptions today, we discussed, there are uh, there are four statements or four keywords that are used in exception handling that are try, except, else, finally. With try block, as we can see this typical flow, complete uh, exception handling with all these blocks, try, except, else, and finally. So we can see the typical structure of exception handling here. So what is try? Try block contains piece of code that might cause an exception or raise an exception. Except block contains a piece of code that is exception when there is an exception in the try block. In any of those statements, Python will catch that exception and will throw that exception into one of the except block. So we can have any number of except blocks here. So this is called except block without any particular exception, which is, we call it as a generic exception. So it catches anything. So typically we can have any number of except blocks like type error and except value error, except attribute error. Like same way we have seen if else ladder, we can have any number of these exceptions. This except generic exception block, which works like a else block in a if else ladder. So else is having different purpose. We will see in a moment. So what it does, if there is an error, for suppose in this try block, as we have seen, try block is used to enclose the block of code that might cause an exception, so that when there is an exception, Python will catch that exception and throw that exception into one of the exception handling blocks. So we can have any number of these blocks, and at the last, if required, this is optional. If we want, we can write a generic exception, but this is not a good practice, writing a generic exception, because it catches everything, but we don't know that particular except, it catches all sorts of errors. If for suppose we have type error that is passed on to this exception block, and this generic except will not be executed because it is already catched. But if there is a value error, that will be thrown into this block. If there is attribute error, that will be thrown into block. But if there is actually import error, but there is no such a block that will handle the import here, that is thrown into generic exception block because it matches all exceptions. But this in practice, so if necessary, then only you are advised to use this generic exception block. Otherwise, this is not encouraged because it catches all exceptions. So we don't know that what we are catching. We have to use typically we importing a sys, and there we can actually, there is except block, you have to use that. But probably you can use if you wanted to actually log any exception, but otherwise you are advised to actually catch a specific exceptions. And if you are actually doing this except block and checking what kind of exception that was raised by actually checking the sys dot exception info, it means it is a code smell, means you are reinventing the wheel. That is a bad practice. Anyway, so let's review it again. So we have the try, that any code that is inside the try will throw an except if exception is thrown, that is catched. And what we include any statement or bunch of statement that may cause exception, and we can write multiple except blocks, and at the end we can write the generic exception block. And once there is an error or exception, Python catches that and throws that if there is a corresponding except block. If there is no corresponding except block, but for that exception, that is thrown to generic exception block if it exists. If it doesn't exist, exception is raised, and program will crash because we haven't handled that. So probably and what else block is for? Else block is for else any code that is part of the else will be executed if there is no such exception. So if exception is not raised, for suppose here we have the code. So there is a difference between else and finally. Else is executed, else block is executed if there is no exception. Finally executed regardless of if there is exception or not. So part of the code is finally is used for the code, for a cleanup, where for suppose if you are working with the files or a network operations, you open a socket or you open a file. It is a best practice if you open a file in a program. It is a best practice and a good for to avoid memory leaks and all. So we should close that file. If you open the file, we should close it. If you open the socket, we should close it, something like that. So we open the file here in try block, and we enclose that inside try block, because if you are opening a file, that might raise the exception with the file not found error, and there are a bunch of exceptions that are related to file handling. We might get file not found error, directory related error, permission error, OS error, like that. So we are actually catching that, trying if file doesn't exist, we might get that error. So if that and we wanted to actually, after working with that file, we wanted to clean up, probably close that file, okay, or if file is opened. So if file doesn't open, even though any cleanup code that we can put inside a finally, because it is executed finally after the exception handling is done. So what is else here when it comes to else? For suppose we open the file, let's check this scenario, let's listen to this scenario. Else block, we have the else block. When that is executed when no exception is raised. It means that code executed as usual manner. So you wanted to get notified when there is no exception. How do you actually check when how do you put a part of the code that is executed, especially when no exception is raised? We put that code inside else block. If you put any statement here, okay, outside except handling, this statement, if you put here, this is executed regardless of what exception, whether exception is raised or not, because it is totally outside. But if you put inside a finally, so here this one, I will be executed always regardless of exception. But you have a bunch of statements, and especially you want to execute them when there is no exception, okay? So in such a case, you put that code here, and you may ask, can you please give me one scenario? I may come across this kind of requirement where executing having a part of the code that needs to be executed when there is no exception. For suppose I'm handling file here, opening f equal to open hello test.txt, okay? I'm opening that in a read mode, okay? Just I have taken this exact file handling, so that the purpose of actually this example is to demonstrate exception handling, not to discuss about file handling. So here, so when we open any file in a read mode, so if that file doesn't exist, what we will get an error, okay? So that I will show you. Let me show you with the terminal, okay? So let's go to Python 3. See, we can open a file, and in a read mode, and I got the file not found error. No such a file or directory. Why? Because I'm trying to access a file which doesn't exist, okay? So I'm not actually print some exception occurred. Why some exception occurred? Because I don't know what exception occurred, because this is a generic exception block, and this is executed regardless of doesn't matter what kind of exception is raised. That particular exception is not handled. Finally, if this code is present, this is totally optional, okay? But if it is present, it's like a garbage, everything is thrown into this except block, if that particular exception is not handled with this with a specific except block. So what happens? This is see, some exception occurred. This will be executed, and check here. Perform file operation when no exception. So I wanted to perform some operation when there is no exception, no exception occurred. Okay, so because if I put that code here, this will be executed regardless of exception. If I put here, this is totally outside the exception handling. This will be again executed if there is exception or not. But if I put here, this part of the code is executed only exception not occurred. It doesn't matter what kind of exception is. So a bunch of code that is in try block doesn't throw any exception. In such a case only, this will be executed. Let's run this thing to check. Okay. Okay, see this thing. What is the output here? So executed this file. Okay, let me execute this again. Python 3. Okay, hello error. What do you see here? I opened the file and there is no such a file. I know that because a while ago we tested that, and you can see no such a file here. So that obviously it throws an error. So since it thrown this part of the code did throw an error, but that is not a type error, not a value error, not an attribute error. And there is a generic exception block. That code is not actually sent to this generic exception block because everything that is not handled is actually thrown into this except block. And I don't know what kind of exception it is because this generic, it catches everything. So some exception occurred. And do you see perform file operation when no exception? You don't see that statement. Why? Because that is executed when no exception is raised. So, and you see, I will be executed always regardless of exception because, it will be executed whether there is exception or not. So after, when it will be executed, this, as the name implies, finally, this is executed when there is exception. This part of the code is executed when whole exception handling is finished. If there is no exception after the execution of try block, this is executed immediately. And you see, this is outside the exception handling. This will be printed always. Let's do one thing, okay? So let me create a file, okay? Let me create a file, new text file, which is, okay, hello text.txt, okay? And let's put, so since I created file, rename this hell to hello, okay? Save this thing. If I run this thing, so check this thing, is the file name same? Yeah. Yeah, it is working. I haven't checked this one. You see. Yeah. Okay, probably, let's put, I was actually confused. Okay, just put some marks, okay? Yeah. I haven't actually noticed this line, Yeah. So, if I execute this one, you see perform file operation when no exception, What happened after opening this file? It worked because there's a file. And then you see some exception occurred. It didn't work, right? Why? This part of the code, why? Because no exception occurred. Yeah, we are able to open that. So this part of the code is executed because no exception. This part of the code is executed, and you see, I'll be executed always regardless of exception. And outside the exception handling, let me remove this thing file. delete. Okay, so if I try to execute this thing again, what happened? You see now error, some exception occurred. Okay, and now you don't see this statement, right? Perform file operation when there is no exception, because the else block will not be executed. Yeah, well, else block will only be executed when there is no exception, and it will not be executed when there is an exception. And finally, you see, in both cases, you see the I will be executed always regardless of exception, which is finally, right? Finally. Okay, it will be executed always. And now, what happens if there is an exception? Let me put one thing, okay? This is also important here. If I put a statement here, file open, okay, and I'm actually printing that. If tell me, I ask you a question, if there is an exception, for suppose when we open the file and there is an exception, file not found error, do you think this statement will be executed? That is a part of the file try block. Yeah, for line number 9, and let's assume we hello.txt text.txt doesn't exist. Just put this hello.txt. Okay, hello.txt is not present. Okay, so what happens if hello.txt is not available? We get the file not found error. I ask you a question. Do you think the next statement will be executed or not? No. That is next. All statements that are beyond or after the statement that caused the exception will not be executed. Abruptly, Python will throw that control flow will be sent to the corresponding exception handling block. Okay, so if I put any statement, okay, processing, okay, and if I put print opening file, okay, so what happens? Check this one. If the first statement is executed, no exception. Second statement is executed, but there is an exception. What happens? It doesn't matter how many statements are there following that particular statement that caused an exception. Python will catch that and will send it to the corresponding exception handling block immediately. Okay, so we can check that thing here. If I execute this thing, and do you see here what happened? Do you see the file? And see here, and do you see here opening file? Okay, opening file. And a second statement actually tried to open the file, and we got the exception because we don't have that a file. We don't have such a file here. Okay, so since exception occurred, the rest of the statements doesn't matter. The particular statement, any statement that caused the exception, till that statement only executed, and abruptly when exception occurred, control flow will be sent to the corresponding exception handling block. Here all these exceptions are actually useless because they are not catching that exception. We have the generic exception block, so it is sent to this except block. You can see the error, some exception occurred, right? And finally you see else block is not executed, right? The perform the file operation, and what we have here is finally, finally is executed. I'll be executed always regardless of the exception. And this is outside exception handling. So what if I actually remove this exception? What if I remove this except block? What happens? and that is optional. You can remove that except block. What happens? Yeah, exactly. It will crash. Why? Because, and it doesn't matter. Finally, okay, or outside, this is not executed. Check this one, okay? And this is one thing we don't expect, okay? One thing we like newcomers tend to confuse, and also some intermediate or experience, thinking that we since we put this in try block, rest of the statements are also executed and the control flow will be sent to the corresponding exception handling block. No, you are not true. You are not right. So abruptly, just leaving the statement that caused the exception, control flow will be sent to the corresponding exception handling block. And there is no corresponding exception handling block that will raise an error. Okay, if there is no corresponding exception handling block. See, I haven't saved this thing. Okay, I removed that, but I haven't saved. Okay, let me save it. And this one is actually without the save. Okay, so let me rerun this thing with the saving. Okay, you see this one, error, some exception occurred. That was part of the except block. We removed that. We haven't saved, but this is from the unsaved file. Okay, so now I run this thing again. Okay, now you see this one. This is a tricky one. Okay, since immediately leaving the statement that caused the exception, rest of the statements are not executed. Python checked, if this is this except block can catch the exception. No. If this can catch the exception, no. If this can catch the exception, no. And finally, there is no such a block that can handle the exception. Not even a generic exception block is there. So what happens? Python raises the exception, that exception, since that exception is not properly handled. So even though we have try except blocks, but there is no such a exception block that catches this exception. So what happened? Our program crashed because of the exception. But like I said, I have been explaining, this finally block will be executed regardless of whether there is an exception or not. There is exception or not. So in this particular case, what happens? Checking all except blocks. Since no such exception block that matches the exception that handles exception, so control flows to the goes to the finally block, and where part of the code inside the finally block is executed, and then exception is raised and causing the program to crash, and the rest of the statements are not executed. Can you see here outside exception handling? It doesn't work, right? Why? Because why? Because the moment, since this exception is not handled, exception is raised as if there is no try except block. Okay, because that exception is not catched. So eventually, if that particular exception is not catched, that exception will be raised and causing a program to crash, or abruptly causing a program to stop abruptly. Since program stopped abruptly, and remaining statements that are outside here on a global level are not executed. You can see outside exception handling. If I run this thing again, and you can see here, thank you is not printed, outside exception handling, both are not printed because the program stopped abruptly because that exception is not handled, and that exception is raised, such that exception is raised and causing the program to crash or stop abruptly. So that is the thing. If I actually put that except block, okay, some exception occurred, and let's save. Let's not forget to save it and run it. And now you see this one, opening file, and some exception occurred, so that program, we have a generic exception block. So if none of these exception blocks catch that exception, always it will be catched by the generic exception block, and we got the finally executed always. And you see this outside of this exception handling. So we have on a global level, we have a top level, we have outside exception handling and thank you, goodbye statements, and that are executed. Okay.